He may not call. He may pull back. But if your energy is still in his system, he can't escape it. Not because you chased him, but because you awakened something within him he cannot yet name. Let us pause here. Not all absence means loss. Not all silence is emptiness. Sometimes silence is the sound of the soul wrestling with its own awakening. When you enter a man's emotional space with presence, self, respect, and quiet strength, you are no longer just a woman in his life. You become a mirror, reflecting what he has not yet mastered within himself. There is a moment in every connection when the emotional bond shifts from words to energy. This moment is where confusion often arises, especially for women seeking certainty from men who suddenly appear distant. But what if that distance isn't a retreat, but a reckoning? In the next part of this talk, we will explore the 9 signs that reveal when you're still in his head, even when he hides it. These signs are not rooted in fantasy, but in science, lived experience, and centuries-old wisdom. They will help you see beyond words, beyond actions, into energy, because presence doesn't disappear just because it leaves the room. Let us begin. He may not always show it. He may not text back immediately. He may even grow quiet for days or weeks, and you start to wonder if you've misread the entire connection. But emotional depth rarely shows up loudly. The human heart, when overwhelmed by what it doesn't fully understand, often seeks stillness. Not to forget, but to make sense. There is a common misinterpretation many women face when a man begins to act distant. It is the belief that distance equals disinterest. Yet what appears as a withdrawal is not always abandonment. In truth, it is often a sign that something meaningful has been stirred within him, something he's not yet equipped to face directly. Men, by nature and by neurological design, process emotional intensity in a way that often requires space. Unlike women, who may seek connection to clarify confusion, men frequently seek solitude to sort through what they feel. The male brain is wired toward compartmentalization. While a woman may feel and analyze emotions simultaneously, a man may need to distance himself from the emotion to understand it at all. This is not a flaw, it's a function of how he's built. And understanding this can shift the way you interpret his silence, not as an absence of feeling, but as the presence of inner movement. A woman once shared a story. She met a man who seemed genuinely drawn to her, attentive, engaged, and spiritually in tune. They shared moments of connection so raw that even silence between them felt like conversation. And then he changed. Calls became shorter, messages less frequent. Eventually, he faded into a vague, almost ghost-like presence. Her first reaction was grief, then doubt, then questions. Did I do something wrong? Was I too much? Not enough? But the truth was simpler and more profound. She had opened a doorway inside of him. She had activated parts of his heart that had long been dormant. In her grounded presence, he had seen a version of himself he wasn't sure how to become. And in that realization, he retreated, not to erase her, but to confront the discomfort of his own emotional inadequacy. This is not uncommon. When a man experiences emotional activation, when he feels truly seen, when your presence triggers a reflection of his deeper self, it can unearth unresolved fragments of his past. Childhood wounds, previous betrayals, the fear of inadequacy. Suddenly, you are not just someone he enjoys, you are a mirror, and the reflection is too bright. Neuroscience supports this. Emotional triggers activate the amygdala, the brain's emotional alarm system. If the intensity of connection feels unsafe or unfamiliar, the brain often responds with avoidance. But this doesn't mean the emotion isn't real. In fact, the stronger the pull, the more likely it is to cause internal resistance. A man's retreat is often a sign that something powerful has taken root. Like a seed buried in soil, it must disappear from view before it begins to grow. And this is where your own inner mastery becomes essential. You must resist the temptation to interrupt his process with demands for clarity. What he needs in that moment is not a rescue, but space. Not pressure, but peace. When you stay rooted in your own energy, when you do not chase, over-explain, or perform, you communicate something that words cannot, that you are a woman of depth, not desperation. And this leads us to a subtle but powerful truth. What you awaken in a man does not disappear, even when he distances himself. The emotions that moved through him in your presence are recorded not just in memory, but in his nervous system. Oxytocin, the bonding hormone, leaves a lasting imprint. Dopamine creates a craving to experience emotional pleasure. When those chemicals fire together in moments of connection, they wire his brain to associate those feelings with you. In Eastern philosophy, there is a teaching: what you touch with pure energy becomes part of your karma. This is not just mystical poetry. It mirrors what science now tells us. Energy exchanges leave a residue. When you enter a man's emotional world with authenticity and intention, he may walk away physically, but a part of him continues to carry your essence. And often, this creates confusion within him, because he may not understand why he thinks of you during quiet moments, why your voice echoes in his solitude, why he scrolls through his phone at midnight, not to message, but to remind himself of your last conversation. The body remembers what the mind tries to forget. A woman who walks in her own calmness, who remains emotionally self-contained, is not easy to shake off. Her presence lingers not because she forces her way in, but because she entered without ego. She was not loud, but she was real, and that reality is difficult to replace. Take, for example, the woman who learns to respond instead of react. When he distances himself, she does not send 5 messages in a row. She does not interrogate or plead. Instead, she withdraws quietly, gracefully. She tends to her own garden. She nourishes her own soul. And in doing so, she does what few women ever learn. She becomes unforgettable without being overbearing. This triggers something powerful in a man: introspection. He begins to ask himself questions he had buried beneath his business. Why am I thinking of her now? Why does her calm disturb me more than another's chaos? These are not casual thoughts. These are signs of emotional awakening. And awakening, by nature, is not comfortable. It is confronting. Yet it is in these moments, when he is alone, uncertain, and unexpectedly pulled back into memory, that he realizes you are not just a woman he once spoke to. You are a chapter he cannot skip, a presence that forces him to reckon with his own emotional limitations. Men are rarely drawn back by drama. What calls to them is what they could not fully grasp, what they sensed but could not articulate. The relationship that didn't seek to possess them, but held up a mirror instead. It is not need that stays in their head. It is meaning. So when you notice distance, let it be. Let him wrestle with his own becoming. Do not collapse your dignity in an effort to feel close. Do not bend your boundaries for the illusion of connection. Emotional clarity begins when you stop translating his silence as self-blame. Every person processes love and longing differently. For some, it flows freely. For others, it must pass through years of guardedness, layers of emotional scar tissue, and beliefs inherited from a lifetime of social conditioning. If he was raised to see vulnerability as weakness, your openness may have scared him. If he grew up watching love weaponized, your softness may have felt like a trap. If he has not yet matured into the man who can hold the kind of woman you are, then your energy will overwhelm him, not because it is wrong, but because it is too right. And still, your energy remains with him. He may find himself hearing your laughter in someone else's silence. He may watch another woman speak, and something in him aches, not not because of what is in front of him, but because of what is missing. And this is not to elevate ego, but to recognize something essential. The way we show up in a person's life, when done with integrity, becomes a standard they cannot unsee. There was a story told of a monk who tended a single tree for 12 years. Every day he watered it, spoke to it, removed weeds, protected it from harsh winds, and one day the tree bore fruit. Someone asked him, "Weren't you tired of giving so much and seeing nothing in return?" The monk smiled and said, "It was never about the fruit. It was about who I became by tending it." This is your role in relationships, not to manipulate outcomes, not to chase what resists you, but to cultivate a presence so rooted, so intentional that even when people leave, they carry your energy with them, not in regret, but in reverence, and perhaps one day they return. Not because you waited, but because they grew. Not because you lost yourself in the waiting, but because you found yourself in the stillness. And that stillness is what stays with them, long after the noise of others has faded. So the next time he grows distant, do not panic. Observe. Breathe. Remain present in your own life. Because if you truly touched something inside of him, something sacred, something deep, he may try to distract himself. He may even deny it to himself. But eventually he will feel it. In quiet moments, in familiar places, in the space you once occupied. You are not out of his mind simply because you are out of his sight. And in the silence of his distance, you may have become louder in his spirit than ever before. There is a profound strength in the energy of someone who does not chase, but instead becomes still. The stillness of a woman who trusts in her worth, even when the man she desires begins to act distant, carries more weight than 1,000 persuasive words. It is a subtle kind of magnetism, and it is rooted not in performance, but in presence. When a woman understands the spiritual art of letting things come to her rather than constantly reaching for what slips away, she enters a space of effortless attraction, not because she manipulates, but because she embodies something few know how to resist: calm confidence. In human relationships, attraction often begins with surface qualities, but the longing to return, to keep someone in mind when they are not present, is rooted in how someone made you feel without trying. Emotional safety is felt more deeply when it's not offered with expectation. There is a lesson often missed in the moments when someone grows distant. The greatest pull often comes from what is not chasing, not clinging, not pushing. A grounded woman doesn't beg for closeness. She becomes the kind of presence one aches to return to when the world feels heavy. There was once a story of a woman who fell in love with a man who was deeply drawn to her. He admired her mind, her laughter, her way of seeing the world. But after several months, he began to withdraw. He still answered her messages, but with less warmth. He still met her occasionally, but he seemed distracted. She noticed herself overanalyzing everything: his pauses, his silences, his tone. The temptation to send long messages, to ask where things were heading, was powerful, but instead she paused. She remembered what she had cultivated before he entered her life: peace, routine, joy. And so she returned to those things. She let the silence stretch. She stopped feeding the connection that no longer had clarity. She became quiet, not out of pride, but out of wisdom. And it was this very silence that unsettled him. Not because she punished him, but because her absence reminded him of the peace he could only find in her presence. This is the principle of non-interference, a spiritual and psychological strategy that is often overlooked in modern relationships. Western culture teaches us to fight, to talk it out, to fix what's broken immediately. But Eastern philosophy teaches that there is great power in retreat, not as surrender, but as alignment. When you stop pushing, you allow space. And it is within that space that true desire either fades or deepens. Men, especially those unfamiliar with navigating their own emotions, often feel overwhelmed when their heart begins to soften. They fear losing control. Emotional intimacy requires surrender, and not every man is prepared to surrender to what he feels. The pull to retreat is often a reflex of emotional discomfort, not a lack of interest. When you remain still instead of trying to force his return, you activate the deeper part of him that must choose to come back. And chosen presence is far more valuable than forced connection. Psychologically, humans are more drawn to what they perceive as scarce or peaceful. This is not a game, it's biology. A woman who does not flood a man's senses with desperation, who does not seek to convince of her worth, is experienced as someone who knows her value. This activates curiosity. And curiosity is one of the deepest emotional hooks because it opens the mind while softening the heart. Stillness is often misunderstood as passivity, but true stillness is deeply active. It's the practice of holding your center when everything around you is trying to pull you off balance. When he grows quiet and you do not panic, when you breathe instead of break, you shift from reaction to command. You do not need to control him because you are controlling yourself, and that energy is unmistakably powerful. There is a teaching in martial arts: the one who moves first often exposes their weakness. The one who remains still gains the advantage of awareness. In relationships, the same principle applies. The one who remains emotionally calm during moments of confusion sees more clearly. When a man pulls away and you do not chase, you are not punishing him. You are respecting yourself. And self-respect is one of the most attractive forces in the human experience. Attraction is sustained not by drama, but by polarity. Masculine energy seeks direction, freedom, and challenge. Feminine energy, when centered, embodies depth, flow, and receptivity. When a woman anchors herself in her own peace, she offers a challenge without saying a word. Come to me as your whole self, or do not come at all. This is not rejection, it is invitation. But it is an invitation only the emotionally mature will recognize. A woman once said, "I used to chase after men who gave me crumbs, thinking if I loved them enough, they'd come closer. Now I realize the man who is meant for me will never be confused about me. And yet, even the man who is meant for you may grow quiet sometimes. Not out of malice, but out of inner conflict. This is where emotional maturity becomes your guide. Do not always interpret silence as an ending. Sometimes it is an awakening, but let that awakening happen without your interference. What you cultivate in stillness cannot be taken from you. And this stillness creates echoes in his mind. When you stop calling and he realizes he misses the sound of your voice, something shifts. When he scrolls through old photos and feels a twinge of something he thought he buried, something opens. When he's surrounded by others but still feels alone, your absence becomes a mirror to his emotional reality. This is where space does its work. Not space filled with bitterness or cold detachment, but space filled with clarity and grace. When he senses that you are not waiting but living, that your world continues to bloom without him, it forces him to ask questions he would otherwise avoid. Questions like, why do I feel her more now that she's gone? And why do I compare everyone else to her? These are not shallow questions. They come from deep dissonance. And that dissonance only arises when your energy is still echoing through his emotional world. Not because you flooded it, but because you flowed through it with integrity. And now we must consider something rarely spoken aloud. When a man feels deeply drawn to a woman, but simultaneously overwhelmed by the depth she brings, it often triggers a sense of losing control. Emotional intimacy can be terrifying to someone who has always found safety in logic, in plans, in personal independence. Suddenly, the heart begins to stir. Suddenly, vulnerability becomes a possibility. And that possibility can feel like chaos to a man who has spent his life avoiding emotional chaos. So, what does he do? He withdraws. Not always because he wants to lose you, but because he wants to feel in control again. It's important to recognize this, not to excuse his behavior, but to understand its origin. When someone suddenly becomes emotionally distant after deep connection, it's rarely random. It's an unconscious effort to restore internal equilibrium. This is why your reaction matters. If you collapse, beg, or emotionally unravel, you confirm his fear that emotions are dangerous. But if you remain calm, if you hold your center, if you allow him to navigate his own internal storm while staying anchored in your peace, you offer him a different reflection, one that challenges yet heals. A real-world example may help here. A man once shared that the woman he remembered the most was the one who never once asked him to define the relationship. She showed up, was fully herself, loved generously. But when he grew unsure, she didn't chase him. She didn't accuse him. She just stepped back. He said, "I thought I could forget her, but years passed, and every other woman reminded me of her. What made her unforgettable wasn't drama. It was dignity. Dignity is a language of the soul, and it speaks louder than pleading ever could." When a man distances himself and you meet that distance with grace, you give him the gift of reflection. He may not thank you immediately. He may not even understand what he's lost. But as time passes, what he remembers will not be your effort to keep him. It will be your decision to release him. And that moment becomes a pivot point in his inner journey. Remember, emotional control is not about suppression. It is about direction. You feel the hurt, but you don't let it dictate your behavior. You feel the absence, but you don't abandon your values. You feel the confusion, but you don't create unnecessary drama. Instead, you sit in it, you breathe, you let it pass. And in that practice, you become powerful. And so he will think of you. Not always at once, not always consciously, but in subtle, persistent ways. In the scent of something familiar, in the rhythm of a song, in the quiet after laughter fades. You have entered his emotional memory, not because you forced your way in, but because you showed him something rare, a love that was free, a heart that was whole, and a woman who never begged to be chosen, because she had already chosen herself. In this space, he may try to replace you. He may try to distract himself, but distraction is not erasure. Emotional memory doesn't delete. It gets stored, and the things stored without closure are the ones that return when life grows quiet. So let your silence speak. Let your peace echo. Let your absence do the work your presence cannot. You are not powerless when you're not reaching. You are most powerful when you are simply being. Whole, unwavering, present in your own life. This is the energy that not only remains in his mind, but begins to change it. And it is the very energy that turns emotional confusion into clarity, not just for him, but for you. A quiet woman is not to be underestimated. In her silence lies a presence, and in that presence is power. When she chooses not to explain, not to chase, not to beg for clarity, she's not withholding, she's watching. She's not disengaged, she's discerning. And this space, this moment of stillness, does something unexpected. It begins to echo in the mind of the one who left. People believe that silence means nothing is happening, but inner silence is often where everything begins. A man who walks away from a woman who knew how to hold her peace will, in time, hear her more clearly than if she had raised her voice. Stillness creates echoes that ripple into the unseen layers of memory and emotion, and what is not addressed consciously will revisit the subconscious repeatedly until it is understood or transformed. When a woman disappears without bitterness, when she chooses her peace over his presence, something begins to stir within him. Not always immediately, but inevitably. This is not manipulation. This is energy. Emotional energy is never truly lost. It is transferred, it is absorbed, and it is remembered. What the mind ignores, the body remembers. What the heart avoids, the soul replays. There is a woman who once walked away from a man she deeply loved. She didn't leave out of anger or pride. She left because she realized that her presence was no longer being met with clarity, consistency, or care. And so, with a steady heart, she stepped back, not loudly, not cruelly, but quietly. Weeks passed, then months. She said nothing. She did not reach out, did not post cryptic messages, did not perform her grief for the world to see. She simply allowed the silence to do its work. And it did. He began to feel her absence like a shadow, soft yet persistent. Her voice, her laughter, her way of seeing him with eyes that didn't try to fix, only to understand. It all returned, not as memory but as sensation. He felt her not just in his mind, but in the hollow spaces she used to fill. That's the power of stillness. It's not about who speaks loudest. It's about who remains loud in your soul when the world is quiet. Stillness, in its highest form, is not about ignoring. It's about observing without reacting. When a woman learns to observe rather than obsess, she reclaims her emotional authority. She stops letting his distance dictate her self-worth. She stops making his confusion her responsibility. Instead, she becomes the calm in her own storm, and in doing so, she changes the atmosphere. Men are not always quick to admit what lingers in their minds, but you will know when you're still present in his emotional landscape, not because he says it, but because of what he doesn't. The unfinished messages, the way he watches your stories but says nothing, the friends who mention your name because he brings you up when he thinks it's safe to do so. These are echoes, not necessarily signs of desire, but signs of memory. And memory is the doorway through which realization often walks back in. Stillness becomes especially powerful when a man is unsure of himself. Many men are raised to believe that emotion must be rationalized, that longing must be suppressed unless it leads to certainty. But emotional connection rarely arrives with certainty. It arrives with invitation. And when that invitation is met with fear or avoidance, the only thing left to remember you by is the way you handled your departure. The woman who walks away with dignity is not forgotten. She becomes the blueprint. Not because she demanded attention, but because she embodied self-respect. In a world where everyone fights to be seen, the one who walks away unseen, but fully aligned, leaves the deepest imprint. He may meet others, laugh with others, even sleep beside others, but he will return to your energy when his soul grows quiet enough to feel what his ego once denied. The memory of your stillness becomes his emotional contrast. While others may have demanded his time, you gave him space. While others tried to win him, you let him go. While others sought closure through conversation, you allowed silence to speak. And silence, when offered with love and not resentment, often says more than words ever could. There's a quote that says, "You never really know the value of a moment until it becomes a memory." This is deeply true in relationships. But even more than the moment itself, what stays with someone is how that moment made them feel. That's why emotional energy is so important. A woman who leaves chaos in her wake may be remembered, but not revisited. A woman who left peace behind, unspoken, unshaken, unmistakable, creates a longing for a return, not just to her, but to the version of himself that only existed in her presence. And this brings us to something even more subtle, but powerful. Your energy has memory, and so does his. Every interaction carries an energetic signature. The way you made him feel when he was around you, safe, challenged, accepted, inspired, didn't vanish when the relationship ended or paused. These feelings are stored not only in his mind, but in his body. Neurologically, emotional experiences create neural pathways. The more emotionally charged an experience is, the more deeply it's encoded. And love, especially the kind that doesn't need to perform, is one of the most powerful emotional codes the human brain can store. This is why you can remember a scent, a voice, a gaze, even decades later. The emotional energy attached to those things bypasses logic and imprints directly onto the nervous system. When you touched his life with presence instead of performance, with honesty instead of ego, you became part of his energetic memory, and no amount of distance can erase energy that was authentically transferred. This is why some men return, not because the circumstances changed, but because the memory matured. Over time, what once felt confusing becomes clarifying. The noise around him fades. The distractions grow old. And then, in a moment he didn't expect, your presence returns, not in reality, but in emotion, in memory, in a deep inner knowing that says, I had something rare and I wasn't ready for it. Many will tell you that if he wanted to, he would. But the truth is more nuanced. If he was ready, he would. Readiness is not just about desire, it's about capacity. A man must be emotionally available to receive and return the kind of love that does not chase. And emotional availability is not created through pressure. It is awakened through contrast. When he experiences a different energy, perhaps one that is chaotic, manipulative, performative, your absence will not just feel like emptiness. It will feel like truth. It will feel like peace he didn't appreciate when he had it. And that feeling will stay with him longer than any passionate argument, longer than any dramatic exit, longer than any loud goodbye. The deepest form of missing someone is not about wanting their body. It's about longing for the feeling they brought into your life. When that feeling was rooted in calm strength and emotional depth, it's irreplaceable. So what does this mean for the woman who waits in uncertainty? It means that the best thing you can offer is not explanation, but embodiment. Embody your peace. Embody your standards. Embody your joy, not for performance, but for truth. And know that this embodiment will leave an emotional footprint in his mind, whether he admits it or not. Men may not speak the language of emotion fluently, but they feel its weight. And when a woman withdraws her presence, without withdrawing her grace, she offers him the rarest of gifts, the chance to awaken. Not through conflict, but through contrast. He sees what he had only when he feels what he lost, and that feeling has a voice. It speaks slowly, but clearly. It says, go back, not to fix her, but to become the man who can stand beside her. Stillness is not passive. It is magnetic. It calls forth what is true. It repels what is false. And it offers clarity to the one who is finally ready to see. And so she continues, not waiting, but walking. Not yearning, but growing. Not proving, but being. And in her being, she remains unforgettable. When someone acts distant, it's easy to assume they've moved on, forgotten, or simply no longer care. But the truth is often more layered, more human. Distance can be a defense. Silence can be a storm. And absence doesn't always mean you've been erased. It sometimes means you've made such an impact that your presence is still echoing through the very places they hoped to guard. You do not need to fight for a place in anyone's life. The energy that is felt cannot be forgotten. What you awaken in another, when done from a space of calm and truth, lingers far longer than words ever could. Stillness becomes your strength, and your peace becomes your power. It is not how loudly you love that leaves a mark. It is how deeply and honestly you show up, and how quietly you can walk away when the time comes. Let go of the need to be understood in every moment. Trust the weight of your energy. Honor your emotional clarity. A woman rooted in her own wholeness does not chase, force, or beg. She holds, she observes, and when necessary, she releases. And in the space where others lose themselves trying to be remembered, she becomes unforgettable.